All right, ready to go. Welcome and Falcha. This is David McDonnell. I'm your host for Random Thoughts from County Antrim. And this is what? What is today? Today's the 25th of April. It's our final podcast for the April Scottish American Heritage Month. And I have a few more stories to tell you of Scotland. I'm going to tell one or two tonight. And I'm going to run out of time, I know it. So I will extend on my own the month of April until next week, which is actually May. And I'll tell yet another Scottish story in May. For that matter, I have a bunch of Scottish stories, so I may extend those. Who knows? I may be telling Scottish stories for several weeks, or I'll scatter them around over the next several months. Tonight I'm going to tell you about Flora MacDonald, and if you can hear some background music, I don't know, maybe the volume isn't loud enough, but if you can hear some background music, that's the Skyboat song, and it's relevant to the story I'm going to tell you, so I'll turn it off right now, but I thought you might want to hear that song, or at least bits of it, because it is indeed relevant to our story. So I'm going to tell you about Flora MacDonald. She was an 18th century Scottish woman. She lived through the Jacobite Rising of 1745. And she and her family chose one side in the war, but Flora became a heroine to the other side. Now, Flora was born in 1722. Her parents were Ronald and Marion MacDonald. And she was born on one of the Hebrides Islands off Scotland's west coast. Ronald died when Flora was still a young girl, and Marion later remarried Hugh MacDonald. And when the Jacobite Rising began in 1745, Flora was engaged to Alan MacDonald, and the two of them actually later did marry. Now, before your imagination runs wild and you begin thinking about things like incest, one should know that virtually everybody in this region, this part of Scotland, had the last name MacDonald. I don't know Flora's mother's maiden name, but I would not be surprised if it too was MacDonald. In any event, Flora went her whole life without ever having to change the monogram on her towels. Now, the backdrop for the story is the Jacobite Rising, 1745. It's often just called the 45. And this was the second Jacobite War, but it actually was the third war in a 5+ decade struggle for the British monarchy. And by 1745, the King of Britain was King George II. And he was contested by Charles Edward Stuart, the grandson of King James II. Now, I'm not going to go through the details of all these conflicts because they're far, far too complicated. But they were strange affairs, and by that I mean that they didn't lend themselves to neat divisions, Scots versus English, or Irish versus Scots, or Catholics versus Protestant. Even though most wars in those days were about religion, but the Jacobite Wars, there were Protestants and Catholics on both sides, on each side. And in Scotland, the wars were as much about clan politics and old rivalries as they were about anything else. And some clans picked one side, and of course, a rival clan would pick the other. Economics were an issue as well, because there was widespread poverty in the British Isles at the time, and some folks saw better advantage in one side or the other. So you just have to look at these wars as just two rivals for the British throne, and with many, many factors leading people to choose one side or the other. And when you look at these wars through a modern lens, it's very easy to ask yourself, who cares who the British king is? But you simply need to understand that it was important to the people at the time, and thus important enough that thus wars were fought. Now, who is Charles? Charles was the grandson of James II, who was King of Great Britain. James II lost his throne to William and Mary in the 1600s, and it was largely a bloodless overthrow in England, but it turned into a very bloody affair in Ireland, and it ended up with James' defeat and further subjugation of the Irish and confiscation of Irish lands in Ireland. After he was overthrown, James II was exiled to France, and he died years later in France. His son was King James III. He was crowned King James III in Paris, although he was a king without a kingdom. His supporters, though, later rebelled and in Scotland, and James III joined in. And this was the first of the Jacobite Wars. They're called Jacobite because Jacobus is Latin for James. Probably should have called them Jamites, but that would have been too easy. But that was the first Jacobite War. And of course, James III was defeated and he returned to France. Now, the 45 was an effort by Charles Edward Stuart. He was the son of James III and the grandson of James II. And he was known as Prince Charles, or affectionately sometimes as Bonnie Prince Charlie. And he was a prince because his father was supposedly a king, but Charles was not the prince of anything, just like James III was not the king of anywhere. But in 45, Charles raised an army, mainly with aid from the French, and the Irish joined in, and particularly the Scottish Highlanders. And nothing was fought in Ireland, but there were Irish who joined in with the Highlanders and the French, joined in Prince Charles' army in Scotland. And for a time, Prince Charles was successful in the wars. The army captured Edinburgh. They moved south and invaded England. Got within a couple hundred miles of London. Charles was expecting support from the English commoners, and when it didn't arrive, he retreated back into Scotland. And there his army was defeated by the British forces of King George II, and they were defeated at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, and that ended the second of the Jacobite Wars. Now, Flora and her family supported King George II. Her stepfather, Hugh, he commanded a royal militia, and her fiancé, Alan, was an officer in the British Army. And after Culloden, the Jacobite army reorganized, and they were prepared to kind of fight on, but Prince Charles abandoned the cause and fled the scene, and the war didn't last much at all thereafter. So with the British victory, the British royalists, George II victory, they scoured the countryside looking for Prince Charles. They offered £30,000 as a reward for his capture, and that's indeed a princely sum. And many Highlanders assisted Charles in his escape, and Charles was on the run for 2 months in Scotland, always one step or two ahead of the British Army who were looking for him. He eventually made it to the island of Benbecula, another Hebrides island, and he was brought there by Captain Con O'Neill. And this O'Neill was from County Antrim in Ireland, and he fought with Prince Charles and assisted Prince Charles in his escape. Now, O'Neill was a distant cousin of Flora. And Flora, coincidentally, was on the island at the same time when O'Neill and Prince Charles arrived. So O'Neill asked Flora for help. Now, Flora wasn't especially sympathetic to the Jacobite cause, but she did sympathize with Charles's plight because he was on the run, and there was a reward for his capture. And if caught, he would likely be put to death. So she was sympathetic to Charles, even though she wasn't sympathetic to his cause. And she later stated that she agreed to help him out of charity, and she would have done the same for anybody in a similar plight. So Flora at the time was 24 years old. She got a pass. Again, this is wartime, so you needed a pass to travel. She got a pass from her stepfather, Hugh. And the pass allowed Flora to sail from that island to the Isle of Skye. And the pass covered Flora plus 2 servants. So once she got the pass, she had O'Neill act as one of the servants. And the pass also included Flora's maid, whose name was Betty Burke. And Flora was going to give Charles one of her dresses to wear as a disguise, but Flora was a small woman, and her dresses were too small. So she got the dress from another woman and gave that to Charles. So Charles dressed as a woman. He dressed as Betty Burke, Flora's maid. And he wore a brightly colored gown and a quilted petticoat, which was common in the day, and then a cloak with a hood so he could cover her face, cover her head. So Flora and O'Neill, Captain O'Neill, and Prince Charles dressed as Betty Burke, sailed with a small crew on a boat to the Isle of Skye. And once there, they hid Charles on the lands of Margaret MacDonald. And Margaret made Charles change his clothes. She thought he looked ridiculous, and then because he looked ridiculous, he looked conspicuous and would likely get caught. And she wasn't sympathetic. Margaret wasn't sympathetic to the cause either, but she didn't want to get her niece, Flora, in trouble, so she helped as well. So the 3 of them stayed on Skye for several days, and then Charles and the O'Neill sailed to another Hebrides island, and then another, until they finally got to a point where Charles was picked up by a French frigate and sailed to France. And Prince Charles spent the rest of his life in France, in Europe, at least the continental Europe, and he never did acquire the throne of Great Britain. And he died in 1788, which is exactly 100 years after his grandfather was deposed as King of Great Britain. And Flora said goodbye to Charles before he departed from the Isle of Skye, but they never met again. Now, as Charles was moving from place to place, the British forces were never far behind. And they heard rumors of Flora traveling on a boat trip with a strange maid. And the British soldiers interrogated the boatmen, and one of them confessed. And Flora was immediately arrested. And Flora gave a statement. She admitted all of it. She did not apologize. She was unapologetic. She said, yes, he was in distress, and I helped him escape. So she didn't get a trial, but she was imprisoned at a couple of places in Scotland before they moved her to the Tower of London, the infamous Tower of London, where she spent over a year in the Tower of London. Now, she was visited quite often, particularly by Jacobites, because she was became a heroine by then. People knew of the escape and how she helped Prince Charles. And many people came to meet her. And ultimately she was released when King George and the English Parliament, the British Parliament, granted an amnesty to everybody that was involved in the Jacobite rebellion. Now, Flora's journey with Prince Charles was immortalized in the Skyboat song that you heard a little bit of in the beginning. That was a song written decades later. It was written in the 19th century. But one of the lines, the beginning lines of the song are, "Speed bonny boat like a bird on a wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky." Some of you may have watched the television series Outlander. It's an historical drama, and it's set in the Jacobite Rising of 1745. I watched the first season, and I did like it, but I have to confess, I never got around to watching any more of it. I just got sidetracked into other things. Someday I may watch the rest of it. I'll binge watch it and catch up. But the Skyboat song, it may have sounded familiar to you when you heard it at the beginning of this podcast, but the Skyboat song is the theme for the Outlander. Now, there's also a traditional Irish dance named after Flora. And the story is often told that Flora danced for the British soldiers to distract them when they were searching for Prince Charles on the boat to Skye. That story's probably not true. It doesn't look like the British soldiers inspected her boat before it left for Skye or when it arrived to Skye. But it is likely that she did dance for Prince Charles somewhere along the line and entertained him while he was in Skye. And she did a very traditional Highland dance, and even today, forever after, that Highland dance is known as Flora's Fancy. Sometimes Flora MacDonald's Fancy, the name of the Highland dance. Now, within a few years of Flora's release from the Tower of London, she did marry Alan MacDonald. They lived in Scotland for a while. Alan got deeply in debt. I'm not even sure what his business ventures were, but they were not successful. So they emigrated to North Carolina in the United States. Actually, it wasn't the United States then. It was American colonies. And while many former Highlanders fought with the Americans when the American Revolution broke out, many Highlanders remained loyal to the English, to the British Crown. And in particular, Flora and Alan MacDonald remained loyal British subjects while in North Carolina. So Alan joined a militia group. It was called the Royal Highlanders. And they did that in 1775 when the war first broke out. And in early 1776, he was captured in a small battle near Wilmington, North Carolina, and was put in prison. In the following year, the North Carolina government confiscated all the property of loyalists, and rebels, American revolutionaries, destroyed most of their possessions. And so Flora and Alan lost everything they had in the American Revolution. And about a year after that, Alan was released from prison. He's about a year and a half he spent as a POW. And then he and Flora moved to Nova Scotia. And they had one harsh winter. One harsh winter in Nova Scotia was all Flora could handle. So she left in the spring for Scotland, and Alan followed a year or two later. Now, Flora died in Scotland at the age of 68, and that was in 1790. And she was buried in Skye, not far, quite close actually, to where she and Charles landed decades earlier. And at least per legend, she's buried in as a shroud. She was buried in a bedsheet that was used by Charles when he was hiding in Skye. In her funeral, by then again, her fame had spread for her role, not so much in the Jacobite Rising, but in the rescue of Prince Charles. And her funeral was attended by like 3,000 people. And her tombstone was inscribed with the words of famed writer Samuel Johnson. And Johnson wrote these words decades earlier when he met Flora before she left for North Carolina. And what he wrote was this. He said, "Flora MacDonald, a name that will be mentioned in history. And if courage and fidelity be virtues, mentioned with honor." Those are the words of Samuel Johnson, and they're inscribed on Flora's headstone in Scotland, where she is buried. So that's Flora's story. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Highland clearances, because it's an important part of Scottish history. And I could subtitle that talk, "Why Are There So Many Scottish Americans?" because it explains why indeed so many Scots migrated to the United States and to Canada. But I think I'll put that off for a couple of weeks, and I have a couple of other Scottish stories that I think I'll tell later. But I think what I'll do for the remaining 5-10 minutes I've got is just tell you a little bit about Irish and Scottish festivals, and a little bit about the differences between the two. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I'm unable to go to any of them. I did not go to a single festival in 2020. They were all canceled. I lined up a fair number for 2021. I was cautiously optimistic, as were most festival organizers, that we'd be able to have celebrations in 2021. And one by one, each of those have been canceled for this summer, and many have already been canceled for the fall. So I'm not likely to go to a single festival in 2021. But what's the difference? Is there a difference between an Irish festival and a Scottish festival? I'm going to tell you the difference from my perception. And Celtic festivals sometimes is a generic name, but most of those with the word Celtic in the title are really Scottish festivals, and they've done name changes to kind of broaden the appeal to anyone from any of the Celtic nations. But what's the difference? Well, Irish festival, almost every Irish festival, it's all about beer and music. Scottish festivals tend to be about competitions and clan tents. In a nutshell, in a generalization, that's the difference. Most of the Scottish festivals have Highland games, and very traditional games performed in the Highlands for centuries, rejuvenated in modern times in the Highland games. Include the caber toss, and if you've ever seen the caber toss, it's men or women lifting up what looks like a telephone pole, lifting it up and giving it a flip. And also, the Highland games also involve taking large objects and throwing them a long way, or taking large objects and throwing them up and over what looks like a pole vault bar. You got to get up and over. A big part of most Scottish festivals are the Highland Games. Now, there's rarely sporting events at all at an Irish festival. The times they are is if you're at an Irish festival and it's in a big venue where there's room. There might be a field, which will be marked off as a pitch. And what you'll see is the local hurling club or the local Gaelic football team playing a game against one of their competitors in the league. So you get a chance to watch hurling and get a chance to watch Gaelic football. And these are guys that just do it for fun, and they usually do it without spectators on a Saturday afternoon, and then go out and have beer together afterwards. So it's nice when they can do it at a festival, because they have a little bit more spectators and a little more fun to do it that way. Scottish festivals typically have dance competitions, so you see these young dancers doing traditional Highland dances. They're doing it on a stage with someone with a table in front of them and a score sheet marking down their scores. So it's very tense for the dancers. Irish dancers compete as well, but they typically don't at Irish festivals. You don't see competitions at Irish festivals. You see a lot of Irish dancers. Irish dance academies will be there, and you'll see these kids or young adults dancing, and it's wonderful. And it's an opportunity for kids and dancers, after all the hours of practice that they go through, to be able to perform in front of a large crowd and have people hooting and hollering and whistling and clapping as they dance. So it's got to be a big boost to their confidence. But they're not competitions. You also see bagpipers at both, but at Irish festivals, you'll see a piper come up and down a walkway, and then put his bag down and then go listen to other people perform. So you'll hear bagpipe music periodically, but it's not the mainstay. The Scottish festivals, it's non-stop. And some of them are competitions as well. I went to one festival that was at a county fairgrounds, and there must have been dozens. I don't know how many dozens of bagpipe bands, fife and drum assemblies there were. And they were in competition. And they had bleachers, and people would march through, and they also had judges keeping score on what they did. And then the next one would come by, and the judges would keep their score. But the strangest thing about it is, because it was a competition, you could not get away from the bagpipers. When they weren't performing, they were behind a tree someplace practicing, getting ready, so they'd be top-notch when they got in front of the judge. There's music at Scottish festivals as well, but it's different. Now, there's a wonderful array of Scottish music, ballads and upbeat music and dance music, and it's a full array, no different than folk songs, no different than Irish music in many respects. But for some reason, those musicians don't get invited to these festivals. These festivals always seem to have the same type of band. I don't know how to describe them other than they're very earthy and tribal and loud. I had one band, I remember, nice guys. I got to meet them during the festival, but the band was 5 pieces. One guy played the bagpipes. Another guy played the didgeridoo. And 3 people played the drums. So you can kind of imagine what that sounded like. Entertaining, but a little bit one-dimensional. Irish, on the other hand, the Irish festivals have multiple stages, and there's non-stop music and the full array: folk music, ballads, instrumental, stuff that sounds very 21st century and stuff that sounds very 19th century. And I suppose the other difference I'd have to say is, I think I'm running out of time here, the other difference I'd have to say are the clan tents. Clan tents are everywhere at Scottish festivals, and you hardly ever see them at an Irish festival. Every single Scottish clan will have their own tent, and there'll be a row of them. And people are very proud of their clans, and they'll wear their clan tartan. And you could never, ever wear a tartan simply because you like the plaid. You have to be part of the clan. It has to match the clan tartan. Your tartan has to match your clan tartan. Once spoke to a woman who wore a tartan that was a little different than the clan tartan, and we were chatting about it. And she told me that the tartan she had was only permitted to be worn by the nobles of the clan, and that she received special permission. She was like the high commissioner of her clan organization, a multi-state organization, and she was the high commissioner of the clan. And when in Scotland, she met the chief of the clan, whoever is the current reigning chief of her clan, and he gave her special permission to wear the clan, the nobility tartan for the clan. And she, and only she, could wear that particular tartan. A long conversation with this woman, and it was frankly one of those that I could not figure out how to gracefully escape. All right, I'm running out of time, so I was going to tell you how I fit in all these, because I don't dance. I can't lift up a telephone pole. I don't play a musical instrument, and I can't sing. Somehow I fit into these festivals, whether it's a Scottish festival or an Irish festival. And next week I'll tell you what I do. So that's all for now. Thank you for joining us. Take a look at my website, clandonald.net. I got the story Flora MacDonald posted. I just posted it today, so you can read about it as well as re-listen to this podcast. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. Like my Facebook page and like this YouTube. And then we'll see you next week. Thank you.